Good morning, everybody. Is that better? Can you hear me? Great. All right. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to the panel here this morning. My name is Steve Boucher. I'm Managing General Partner of InQtel. I'll be your host today. I think we have a great set of panelists here, including one that will be joining us here in a little bit that's running a little late, and we're very excited to talk to you today. However, a couple of us are from the West Coast, and we're on West Coast time, so we're going to need to really ride the energy of all of you in the audience here to make this as strong as possible. So we're going to try this again. I'm going to say good morning. Everyone's going to say good morning back. So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. Thank you. That is the sort of energy that's going to make this a great next hour or so. If you haven't read, the session overview describes what we're going to talk about here is market forces outside the federal government often drive technology development that is critical to intelligence operations. The U.S. intelligence community would benefit by accessing and in some cases influencing the development of that technology. The venture capital and entrepreneurial communities are incentivized to bring their products to the markets that drive investment and early adoption. This panel will address how the U.S. intelligence community, the venture capital community, and startup entrepreneurs can work together to better synchronize and accelerate adoption of emerging technologies in the federal government. That's a big topic. We're going to talk a lot about that. We have some great folks here to speak, but we also want to hear from you. And so we're going to talk with some questions I'm going to provide for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have a half hour to respond to questions from the audience. So I think we have Ryan and Katie. If you guys could raise your hands. Are you guys? Katie's right here. Ryan is around here somewhere. But I believe there are index cards on your seats. We're going to go old school, great tradecraft here. No electronic access to the discussion here today. Instead, you're going to write down some questions and pass them to folks as they walk through the audience here, and they will collect them and come up and read them to us. So we really want to address everything that's on your mind, so please don't hesitate to write those questions. And as I said, we have a full half hour to respond to them. I want to start by allowing each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And we have, I think, 4 people representing 4 different stakeholders that are pertinent to this conversation. The person who is missing and will come late and join us here at the end, hopefully, is Dawn Myricks. Dawn is the Director of S&T, Science and Technology, for the CIA, and she will represent, obviously, the U.S. government in its perspective here. Representing the venture capital community is Ann Winblad. Ann, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself a little bit here.
Great, and I'm one of those West Coast people. Can you hear me on my mic? Great. I'm one of those West Coast people, so it is very early morning for me. I am a venture capitalist, the co-founder of Hummer Winblad Venture Partners. We were the first venture capital firm focused 100% on software, which was considered quite outlandish thing to do when we got started in 1989. We're currently investing our 7th fund. We invest exclusively in software and enterprise software, all the software that's used to build other software. We've invested cumulatively about $1.3 billion. We start at the A round, so we truly stress the word venture in venture capital. And we have helped launch about 150 enterprise software companies. Some names you've heard of recently, a recent IPO, a company called MuleSoft. We funded Mule when there were 4 people in 5 countries. Today they have 1,000 employees and over 1,000 customers and a market cap of about $3 billion. And a local company, Sonatype. Sonatype also was a 2-person company when we funded it. Today they have several hundred people. And they are a leader in the secure DevOps environment.
So Ann's being a little modest. Hummer Winblad is one of the premier venture capital firms in the United States. As she mentioned, been around since 1989, and as you can tell by the name, Ann's been involved since the very beginning. We're very lucky to have her join us here today.
Thank you.
In addition to the government and the venture capital, we have 2 more stakeholders that are important to this conversation. The first of which is large, successful technology companies, and we're fortunate enough to have Jeff Herbst from NVIDIA join us here today. So Jeff, maybe you can introduce yourself and NVIDIA a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Really a pleasure to be here. So my name is Jeff Herbst. I am the head of corporate business development for NVIDIA. Some of you may still not have heard of NVIDIA. We're about a $100 billion market cap company. We're actually one of the biggest, most influential companies that a lot of people haven't heard of, which is why Don Clark penned the article in the New York Times. I think it was just this past weekend on NVIDIA, and how we kind of came out of nowhere as a PC computer graphics company to become one of the most influential companies in high-performance computing and data center and AI. So I run the corporate business development function. I've been doing this for around 16 years. That includes our GPU Ventures program, where we have about 20 active investments in AI, data analytics, self-driving car companies. I also handle all of our merger and acquisition activities, as well as some of our major strategic partnerships. Some of the stuff that we're really interested in right now is data analytics. We have investment in a company called MapD, which I think is really interesting. Image recognition, voice recognition, natural language processing. There's a company called SoundHound that we work very closely with. So really delighted to be here and talk about ways that we can collaborate with federal government. And one thing people may not be aware of is we're actually going to have a big GPU technology conference here in DC in a couple of months. So I'd urge anyone who's really interested in what we're doing and some of the synergies to come check that out.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Welcome, Dawn. We'll come back to you in just a second. We'll give you a moment to get settled. The last stakeholder, as I said, we wanted to have represented on this panel is the startup community. The U.S. venture-backed startup community is the innovation engine here in the United States these days, and we're fortunate to have a multiple repeater successful founder, and Scott Petrie join us. So Scott, if you could introduce yourself and your current company, Authenticate.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I'm here representing the Sisyphus community. We are continuing to push a bigger and bigger rock uphill. My name is Scott Petrie. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Authenticate. We build a secure virtual browser. That means a browser runs on our servers, not your machines, and it keeps basically 100% of the web out in an environment that can be controlled and destroyed when you're done. When I started the company in 2010, I didn't think I'd be sitting here at a National Security Summit talking about startups selling into the government. In my prior company, we had built a pretty nice business, and it was a pioneer in the cloud space, and we did not have, when I sold the company to Google, we had something like 40,000 businesses that we provided services to. Not one was a federal organization. We sold to state, local, we sold to small, medium, large, we sold to defense contractors, we sold to pretty much everybody under the sun, but cloud services was sacrilege to the government, and when I started this company in 2010, as I said, I didn't think I would be selling to the government, but what I've seen since then has been a real turn of attention and desire to take advantage of some of these technologies, and so I'm happy to say representing favorably, hopefully, the startup community and how it plays into the federal government space. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. So Dawn, welcome. I did introduce you in your absence, but if you want to just say a little bit about yourself and your background, I think that'll be great.
Okay. Let's see. Can you hear me? Oh, there I am. Okay. So thank you for everybody for vamping for me while I went through DC traffic. I appreciate that. So as John Brennan accused me, I guess I can't hold a job. I've been in and out of industry and in and out of government and done FFRDCs and supply chain and AOL. So kind of an eclectic career, and I couldn't be more delighted to be part of the panel today. So.
And I think Dawn is unique, as I've interacted with a lot of senior technical leaders within the U.S. government, in that she does have a background both within government, but also she spent plenty of time outside of government, and I think that gives her a great perspective that we'll be pulling at over the course of the conversation. So, Dawn, if I could start with you, can you talk about how U.S. government's view on sourcing technology has evolved over time? You know, it used to be that the U.S. government either built it themselves or they had big system integrators that provided everything for them. But that's changed recently. You can talk a little bit about how that's evolved.
Sure. So I span 30 mumble years of technical service, I guess. And when we first started, government was clearly the innovation engine for pretty much the tech industry writ large. I was an undergrad at Carnegie Mellon and was one of the early users of the ARPANET, and email way, way, way back in the day. So when I first got to government, I just thought, we were the kind of the end-all, be-all. So fast forward to today, we are dwarfed in terms of our R&D investments by what commercial industry is doing. The top 5 R&D budgets on the planet are commercial entities, and so in our mission to do what's best for the nation and to provide the kind of national security that we need, we must leverage other people's R&D, and we must figure out how to do that at speed and at scale. And it's a matter of relevance at this point, and we have to get past the hubris and the arrogance that it can only come from the government. I think what we bring, and I'll be interested in as the panel speaks, and I've talked to a few of them before, so I think I know what the answers are, but what we bring is the security consciousness and the scale that gives them unique opportunities to explore where their products can go that benefit them commercially as well as in government service.
So, Ann, I'll turn to you next. The U.S. government's a big market, right? They've spent a lot of money on technology. That should be music to your ears as a venture capitalist. Why aren't more startup companies going after the U.S. government as a market? As a venture capitalist, how do you help them think about those choices?
Well, by nature, startup companies are resource constrained. And at the same time, they're very smart about spending their resources. So they like to know outcomes before they get started. And today, I think startups view the federal government as a risky customer to achieve outcomes. At the same time, we've seen the pace of innovation and new projects accelerate with many of the government's innovation centers. A couple examples, AWS's Innovation Center in the Bay Area with the CIA has a lot of new projects getting started. Georgia Tech, a university example, their research institute, I think that's with the Veterans Administration, also has a lot of great projects started. The challenge is that there are more projects getting started than will likely get funded in the long term. And that's unsettling to startups. But at the same time, what I would say is that you've got a crescendo of more interaction and engagement with startups for the first time with these innovation centers. We've seen this process happen with major corporations in the Bay Area as well. Almost every major corporation set up an innovation center over the last 10 years. And the first few of those failed. They failed miserably. But then we look now, we see GE's Innovation Center has thousands of employees. Almost every one of the car companies has a very robust innovation center in the Bay Area on autonomous vehicles. So we think that the federal government, we hope the federal government is going through the same early stage of these innovation centers, but they can learn from corporate America how to skip the fail first part and go to the succeed part. And perhaps more funding will move towards the innovation centers away from the center-controlled budgets of the federal government. That would be helpful as well.
Great. So Scott, you're an entrepreneur. You're making these choices about how to apply resources that Ann just described. Talk me through how you thought about the various vertical markets that you could go after when you started Postini, your previous company, and then more recently when you started Authenticate.
Yeah, so I think probably wasn't as mature or smart about the market in the Postini days. We were, the classic entrepreneurial, have a great product idea, we'll build something, and a better mousetrap, and the world will beat a path to our door.
Tell the audience what Postini did.
Okay, yeah. So Postini was I started the company in 1999 with an eye towards making email work better. My career started at a company called Apple Computer in the 80s. I worked on a number of interesting projects, one of which was this crazy handheld product called Newton. And one of those things we were trying to do on Newton was to try to bridge the gap between, what were then, this was well before internet, land-based resources, file services, print services, et cetera, down to the desktop and down to the handheld device. I left Apple in, I don't even want to think of the dates, my God. I left Apple in 93. Exactly, sometime before 2000. In 99, I realized everybody was starting these companies around this thing called the internet as things started to get more connected, and everybody was focused on what the browser was doing and middleware servers and destination portals to deliver information. And I realized that email was the backbone of business communication, and yet it was completely overlooked. There was no disruptive internet wave for command and control as people tied all these services together. Said another way, the protocols were designed brilliantly. If I set up a mail server, that server can send a message to any other mail server in the world, and the job of that receiving mail server is to write that message to disk. It could be a good message, it could be a bad message, but that's the way the protocol works, and that's why it's so wonderful and ubiquitous. Our thought was to say, stand in the middle between that. Try to do some intermediating between the senders and the receivers so that you're only delivering proper email down to the endpoint, or I was thinking about things beyond security when I started the company. In order to relieve the burden of the local mail server, we had this great tailwind that defined a product market, or the target market for us, called spam. Has anyone heard of spam? In the 90s, it was not a big deal, and it wasn't really our focus. We did some content processing in the email stream as we stood in the middle between multiple mail servers. As soon as things like the I Love You or the Melissa virus took off or the spam volume started ratcheting up, we took advantage of that opportunity and we built a massive in-the-cloud security platform for processing email. And the beautiful part of our system was when spam hit 30%, 40%, 50%, 70% of the inbound mail load, that stuff never touched a customer server. Our service infrastructure would absorb it. So IT could focus on providing mail services that were credible and reliable to their users, and we could worry about all the garbage. And as I said, we built that into a pretty nice business, and we sold that to Google in 2007.
So the great thing about that is everybody has that problem.
Yeah.
So you had choices to make about which vertical markets to go after.
That's right.
Walk us through how you thought about that.
Okay. I'm really airing some dirty laundry here. When I started the company, but Ann knows this. She's seen seed presentations and the A presentation and then the B presentation, and she's probably really nice about not comparing what you said last time. When I started the company, we were thinking.
But I do keep notes on everything.
Yeah, you do. Okay, good. I thought it was going to be the ISP world, the consumer internet services, the Hotmails, the Netscape mails, the sort of bulk consumer-facing mail services. And my thought was to drive not just security services down into the community, but actually things like, back then you couldn't forward a mail message to your phone, right? You couldn't forward a mail message to your server. You had to install client-side software, which would pop your mail and then redirect it through a side channel. The very early days of BlackBerry. This was the 90s, people. This was back when I was, young. And so my thinking was to move some of that processing power up into the cloud. And we built a portfolio of prototype applications. Intelligence mail forwarding, which would require content analysis, the ability to take, like, people send you a 5 megabyte picture of the vacation. You don't want that showing up on your laptop or a small device over your dial-up connection. So we could compress and redefine that, store the high fidelity image in the cloud, and provide you a little thumbnail on your device. A bunch of automation services like that. We started to talk with ISPs, and they said, basically, hey, this is really interesting. But this isn't useful for these applications aren't useful to us. What would be really useful would be keeping all the garbage off of our network and making sure that our mail services don't infect our customers' devices. And so the market told us what vertical to focus on. We then moved into the commercial markets and started selling that solution. And we targeted early markets that we thought would have that same issue with quality of service and integrity of payload for employees. Law firms were our first target. Law firms for a variety of reasons. They're our first target at my company today as well for a variety of reasons, and I'm happy to talk more about the legal community. It's an awesome microcosm of a lot of disparate forces and very sensitive information. From legal, we moved into financial services. From financial services, we moved actually, interestingly, into manufacturing companies and consulting companies, accounting firms, and then from there the snowball fell. And then ultimately,
I didn't hear government. Why no government?
Our target market became anybody connecting a mail server to the internet. Anybody, literally. As I said, when we sold, we had 40,000 businesses. We did not have any traction with government. We had a couple of outreaches. We talked to some of the labs. The closest we got was Tennessee Valley Authority did become a customer, but they weren't an official government entity at that point. They were basically an asset being managed by federal regulation, but they were still an IT organization. The reason why we never got off the dime with government is because we were doing processing out in the cloud. We were keeping spam and viruses off of a customer's mail infrastructure by absorbing it on our servers, not letting it reach the endpoint. the alternative for the customer was to basically install antivirus, anti-spam filtering on every mail server. That's a mess, but that's kind of the typical way IT was going about their business. We were able to change that behavior pattern in the commercial worlds, but the federal government never got comfortable with the cloud as a solutions platform.
We'll come back to that because they are getting more comfortable with that today. Jeff, NVIDIA executed one of the most difficult things to do in the tech world, which is a pivot, a successful pivot, I should say. lots of people execute pivots. It's much harder to do it successfully as a public company. Can you talk a little bit about how NVIDIA changed its focus and its strategy as a company, and how the government fits in as a potential customer for the new strategy?
Sure. So I'm going to try to be pretty brief about it, but it was a lot more complicated than I'm gonna lay out here. And by the way, I think the story is still being written on the pivot. I think we're not even midway through it. But NVIDIA always believed that graphics processors or massively parallel processors were going to have applications outside of visual computing and gaming. And we basically listened to our customers, and we saw early on, 2001, 2002, researchers and scientists started using graphics processors to program things that had nothing to do with visual computing, like electromagnetic simulations, fluid dynamics. People started using us for oil and gas and seismic analyses. The problem was that they had to program these graphics processors in, and I won't bore you with technical details, but very technical APIs called DirectX and OpenGL. And we recognized there was going to be a market for things that had nothing to do with graphics processing. So what did we do? We set about and we built tools. We built frameworks. We built a platform, and ultimately we launched it as something called CUDA, C-U-D-A. Fast forward to today, we created basically a petri dish, an environment for people to go build the next generation of high-performance computing applications. And it turns out that AI or deep learning looks to be the killer app for our platform. And so, long story short, people look at NVIDIA and go, well, you guys were just in the right place at the right time. You guys were very lucky. Fact is, though, we almost destroyed the company through this transition. The amount of money that we invested, the billions of dollars that we invested over the years, really, we didn't start to get the return until very recently. And that's why I believe we have a pretty good moat around AI and high-performance computing. But we'll see where the story ends. I'm excited. It's been 16 years for me, and I'm hoping I'll put in another 16, and then we'll see where we are.
Yeah. So as you said, the story's not ended yet, but NVIDIA is certainly one of the hottest companies in the Valley right now. And if you haven't heard of this thing called artificial intelligence, NVIDIA is going to power all of that, and that's important to the U.S. government. So now, you're a public company. You have, quite frankly, some very cutting-edge, innovative technology. How do you guys think about what vertical markets to go after as a public company?
Yeah, so we look at hard problems. So NVIDIA has always been a company that does stuff that's really hard to do because we think it's protectable, and we go after things that we think we're uniquely able to handle. And I think you're right. The stuff that we're doing right now has many more applications to the federal government than the stuff that we were doing before. Sure, we had a federal team, talking about, visual computing and computer-aided design. But right now, the things that we're pretty deep in are security. So things like IVA, image recognition, facial recognition, voice recognition. And more what you're going to see is an explosion of big data analytics applications around AI. And I think we're just at the cusp of some of that stuff taking off. The low-hanging fruit in AI was, recognizing a face or recognizing an image. But there's massive amounts of data that sit inside corporations and inside the federal government that need to be processed in real time. And I think we're in a unique position to be able to service those markets. So you're going to see NVIDIA doing more and more with the federal government. I think a lot of the comments, we've already heard, ring true for us. It takes longer to work with the government. You have to invest the time. But for the things that we're doing now, I think we're in a very unique position to add more value than we have ever been able to do to government and national security.
Great. So Ann, you're sitting there in a boardroom, and your entrepreneur or CEO comes to you and says, okay, we got exciting technology. We think there are 5 different vertical markets that we can apply it to. Government's one of them. What are the characteristics of the vertical markets that you want to hear described to sort of choose which ones to go after? And as a early stage, investor, board member, how many vertical markets do you want to see a startup company go after? Because I think it's important for the audience, particularly the government-oriented members of the audience, to understand what the dynamics are as a startup company figures out where to apply its technology.
I think what we've already heard is that what companies want to be when they grow up is a platform company. And most companies start as a product company. And as a product company, they have to figure out where they're going to land, which markets are most receptive. Today, if you look at the big theme of digital transformation, the financial services industry has been a huge early adopter of software, new software, including AI and machine learning. Look at Goldman Sachs. They have more software developers than bankers. So when we invest in a company, we do not look at it as a vertical market by vertical market. We look at, does everybody have this problem? I'll give you a good example of a common problem. And then we say, well, where can we go where there's already been a budget set aside for this, where there are willing architects, software developers to embrace this, where it can land and later expand as a platform. The whole software supply chain, which is DevOps, certainly people are making more software today than ever. If every major industry is reinventing their software supply chain. So where do we go first? In the case of most of our DevOps companies, they went to financial services first. However, when they look at where software developers are, you cannot ignore the federal government. There's a lot of software made here. At the same time, the descriptors around these newer markets are, there are no silos, including with big data. There is much more collaboration. There are standards in governance across the broader environment. So when we look at the US government, we have to say, are the silos getting broken down? Is there collaboration amongst all the makers? Are they going to get the same benefits from the DevOps tools as a Goldman Sachs or an American Express or a JPMC? So those we don't look at it as just the federal government, but the dynamics of what's happening with your architects and developers and your builders of software. And we see that starting to happen, that there is more collaboration, that the makers are getting more importance, that you are making as much software as anyone else, that you're adapting and using open source, which has become key to being a software builder. But we don't see you as the first market. So we ask in that boardroom, does this vertical, which might be the federal government, have the same components and characteristics of the more accepting, willing, and vibrant places we can land and later expand and stay there as a valued platform?
Great. So Dawn, coming back to you, you said in your earlier remarks that the US government has realized it can no longer build all the technology itself. So how do you think about when to make versus when to buy? And then you've now heard or discovered over the years all this great innovation occurring in the startup companies and in the large tech companies. How do you think about making yourself a more attractive customer for these companies to go after?
So let me start with the make versus buy. I think our special sauce, particularly in the intelligence community, is our ability to do systems thinking that brings together very unique phenomenologies in interesting and unique ways. So it's big data, machine learning, AI, kind of on steroids for very specific purposes. So what we're trying to do, and I'll say that this is a work in progress, is not build those things that we can get through other mechanisms, right? And engage through InQtel and through the labs and things like that with spotting and assessing and recruiting early, if I can use those terms, which is what I think InQtel does on our behalf with the Valley and with the VC, the US VC market writ large. That is a culture change for us, right? So I won't say I think Anne's right. I think we are in the, I won't even say we're probably walking yet. We're probably still crawling a bit. But it really comes down to we can only do development where it is absolutely unique to us because there's not a market there, because it's some obscure phenomenology that nobody else cares about. And I think it's important for us to continue to maintain that capability because we're not good consumers if we're not good lead users. And so we're trying to find that sweet spot where we're still building the expertise that we need in order to be good partners, but not replicate what we can write a check for. So we get best value for taxpayer dollars, basically, right? And then I apologize, what was the second part of the question?
How do you make yourself a more attractive customer?
So that's a lot about speed, and that's about not making the bar so high that it feels impenetrable, particularly to a small company that's trying to get to the market. I think the good thing about government is once we're in, we're kind of all in, and we're pretty reliable in terms of payments and all of those sorts of things. So we can cover fixed costs if you can get that deal, and that's another thing we've been working very hard, as you know, with In-Q-Tel, so that we balance that, kind of really fixated look at security with better than what we have. And that's not always something, I'll say that's another work in progress that we have still work to do. I think the big change for us is how we balance the speed of technical evolution on the outside with the speed of bureaucracy. So we have our own set of things that we have to knock down, and I think in partnership with some of the folks here, we are making significant progress. It's not good enough yet, but I think particularly our younger workforce, if I can say that probably comes out wrong, is much more used to this kind of development. And so as my predecessor used to say, we can't be the dinosaur eating its last leaf, right? It's those of us that have been around for a while that have to get over we invented it all, and so we must control it all because it's just not the way of the world these days.
So we have a large customer that wants to buy technology from innovative companies, both large ones like Jeff represents and small ones that Scott and Ann represent. It should be easy, right? Because they want to sell to large customers like Dawn. We're going to talk a little bit here about some of the problems that make it not so easy. But before I do that, I just want to mention that we're about 10 minutes left in sort of the part of the session where I'm asking questions, and then we're going to have a half hour where all of you can ask questions. So Nathaniel's over here, Katie's back there. If you have questions that you want put on these next cards and pass to them, we'll be getting to them shortly. So Scott and Ann, let's come back to the two of you. One of the issues that Scott mentioned in the beginning was the idea that his first company was a cloud-based company, and the U.S. government wasn't really ready to absorb cloud-based software and services. And maybe I'll start with you. What's the percent of software companies that you see today that are cloud-based versus ones that are willing to deploy a version of their software behind the firewall?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
100% of the companies develop their software on the cloud. There are hybrid examples because clearly the software that's developed and deployed has to support the hybrid model. MuleSoft's a classic example because the legacy stuff doesn't just disappear. But there is absolutely no company that's come to us that is not involved in the cloud for the last 10 years. As AWS, which is almost 11 years old now, they seeded that market even before people knew they exist. The economics for new companies are superior to not using the cloud for development, let alone deploying in the cloud, whether it's AWS, Google, or Microsoft, or IBM.
And what percent of the companies would you say are working on AWS?
3 years ago, I would have said 99%, but definitely, we've got market forces at work, so there's a lot of competition between the contenders. Specifically, Microsoft is playing a bigger role, especially in the later commercial adopters who were Microsoft customers. Google is not going away, and IBM will always have a foothold there. But definitely it is dominated today by Amazon, but that could change over time.
And Scott, how much thought did you give to when you started Authenticate about doing it on the cloud versus doing a classic enterprise?
What is this classic enterprise thing you speak of?
It's gone.
It's just
Gone.
not
Exactly.
an option.
Exactly.
Like, if we were building a software platform for maximizing the yield of chip or wafer manufacturing, maybe so, but anything you do with a computer, by definition, is going to be interconnected, and by definition, it means it's going to live on other computers you don't control.
Okay, great. So, Dawn, 10 years ago when I joined In-Q-Tel, one of the aspects that customers often asked us to help them with, customers being government agencies, help them with as we worked with startup companies, is to get them, to convince those startup companies to do a behind the firewall version of their software, because the government wasn't ready to absorb cloud-based software. One of the most innovative things I've seen over the last 10 years in the government has been the CIA initiative to partner with Amazon to develop C2S. Talk a little bit about that and how that has unlocked the ability for not just your agency, but other agencies to take advantage of the
Yeah, so
software.
that's an easy one. We've actually looked at that pretty hard. So when we had a good idea, from good idea to actually being able to implement was about an 18-month productivity cycle. Either you had to write contracts or you had to buy hardware, and the way we buy hardware is we wait until we accrete enough so that we could get good discounts. So if you hit it at the wrong part of the cycle, I mean, you can write this story. You all know what it looks like, and you've all dealt with this. We actually worked really hard when we did the C2S acquisition to ensure that our developers can have the same experience that your developers can, which is basically if you have an impact card, or in our case a BLI, which doesn't matter what it is, but a way to charge, you can have a runtime environment in the next hour. You can spin it up to be, whatever you need it to be to run a job overnight, and then, release it back to the pool. I think that has helped us incredibly, but it's also incented small companies to be willing to do business with us, and that's what the labs, the In-Q-Tel labs and other things are focused on. SVIO is getting you part of the way into the tent so that we can try before we buy, and not making it so onerous to get into the runtime, so that we can actually have real users on it, giving you real feedback that you can monetize, with the idea that we can then make enterprise decisions basically at speed. And I don't want to trivialize, you can't walk into SVIO today with your application and throw it on and call it a day. What's been really interesting about it, and Amazon's been a great partner, is that as we have discovered security flaws or scaling flaws, and yes, they even exist in AWS, that they have immediately jumped on that and incorporated it, and then offered it back as part of their commercial offering. So it's, I think, been a good partnership bidirectionally, and the productivity gains are, folks, we bring young people in and they're like, wow, I didn't expect to find this in government. It's a night and day kind of experience.
So Jeff, it's not just software that's moving to the cloud, right? Talk a little bit, you guys could be in the business of just selling chips, but you're not. You're doing more. How are you thinking about providing your technology in a hosted or platform format?
So specifically to the cloud, or just in general?
In general, yeah.
Yeah, so we consider ourselves to be a platform company, and we start from the same underlying hardware, which is GPUs, but we apply it across multiple verticals: self-driving cars, gaming, professional visualization, and the data center. And then within the data center, we see key verticals as being security, healthcare, finance, and so for each of these, robotics is another big one. And so for each of these particular areas, we have to provide a software stack and tools to allow people to build the applications on top of it. So just to give you self-driving car as an example, we build a complete platform. We're not building the actual cars ourselves. We have a prototype because we had to go build a prototype to show people how to do it. But every car company is going to want their own secret sauce. The same is going to be true in kind of security, voice recognition. So what we hope to provide, to our commercial customers and also the government, is a platform from which you guys can then go build what you want to. So I think most people don't realize this, but NVIDIA actually has more software engineers than hardware engineers. I think we have about 11,000 people. I think it's at least 4,000, 5,000 are software engineers now. So the software is going to become increasingly important. And as you see all these other companies who are trying to get into AI, the thing they do not realize is the huge software investment that has to be made in this whole area to get customers up and running. So verticalization and specialization is going to become more important.
Great. So one challenge has been the fact that the technology world has been developing software technology be consumed one way and the government traditionally consumed it a different way. We seem to be making progress on that thanks to the C2S program. Another challenge is something called FOCI, which everyone in the government or government-related folks will understand. But let me tell you something. You use that acronym in Silicon Valley. No one understands what that means. But it stands for Foreign Ownership, Control, and Influence. And it's a big problem. And it's not just a big problem for startup companies. Jeff, even though NVIDIA is a U.S. company, I'm going to take a risk here and ask a question I actually don't know the answer to, but hopefully your answer will support my point. Do you have any foreign development at NVIDIA in terms of developers located overseas?
Absolutely. We have a lot of our employees are in China, they're in India. We just opened an office in Israel.
Yeah.
So yes, we do a lot of development overseas, and I think I know where you're going with this question, and I'm happy to address it, but I think that technology developed overseas is becoming more and more important, and I'm happy to talk about it. I actually spent a lot of time in Israel. I just got back, so I can tell you what's going on there, but incredible stuff.
Yeah, I'd love to build on that. And Anne, the companies you're investing in, first of all, are you looking at just U.S. companies, or are you looking at overseas companies? And even the U.S. companies, do they have development overseas?
We only invest in North America-based companies, but there has not been a company in the last decade where the co-founding team or the starting team is not distributed around the globe. The MuleSoft example, we funded 5 people in 4 countries. Yeah. Even today, we have a large development organization in Buenos Aires. One point I will make is that in the venture capital world, last quarter was the first quarter ever that greater venture capital dollars were invested in China than in the United States. Granted, that was driven by later stage and larger deals, but we have a software industry and tech industry that's at a much bigger scale, so I don't consider that something you consider an exception. It will always be the case. It's a small number, but it does demonstrate that even though we believe that the Silicon Valley still dominates in total dollars and total deals, capital is getting more widely distributed, especially towards China.
Yeah, the joke in Silicon Valley 15 years ago was that venture capitalists who for the previous 10 years had proudly beat their chest and said, we're not making investments in any company we can't drive to because it's important for us to be interacting with that founding team on a weekly or almost daily basis. We're all of a sudden filling up the first class cabins from the San Francisco to Shanghai flights to fly over and invest in China. And what you've seen over the last 15 years is a gradual increase in venture capital activity in China to the point where, as Ann pointed out, it's now an equal market to the United States in terms of venture activity. So Dawn, as a U.S. government senior executive, does it make your head hurt to hear about how all the technology is now, innovation is now no longer in the United States, but in great places, not just overseas, but in great places like China and Israel and other countries that are perhaps not easy for you?
Honestly, it does a little bit, but I think that the reality has been, and I remember having this conversation at Microsoft, I want to say 20 years ago, I asked them where their drivers were written, right? And the answer was China. Well, if you're going to go after an operating system, where would you go? I mean, go to the drivers. Nobody, that's like the black hat magical art that very few people want to get their hands even dirty on. So I think part of what we have to deal with, and this is part of our security thinking too, is that that's already the way of the world. I mean, that we are layered on so much commercial software that is being developed globally. I think, again, we have to think very carefully about where there are unique equities that we have to be very certain that we protect, and we have to then figure out how we think about that in terms of our investments and our partnering, right? And I will say that, and some of you here in the audience have heard me talk about our governance structures as a USG writ large are still pre-World War II kinds of things, right? And I think that needs a really hard look and a general overhaul, because this idea that somehow the U.S. is the center of all innovative technology is something that we've actually encoded into our laws and how we think about it, and that's just not the case. One of the stats I love to use is that of 70 quantum principal investigators that IARPA has, 17 are U.S. citizens. So if we want to be relevant and if we want to continue to prosecute national security missions, we're going to have to rethink this and do the right things from a governance perspective, but also from a investment perspective to face the reality that's in front of us and not try to pretend it was something else.
Yeah, I think Don made the comment earlier that the top 5 most valued U.S. companies, which are all tech companies, and 4 of the 5 are software companies, that their R&D budget this year combined of those 5 companies is estimated to be above $60 billion. That's almost equal to last year's $67, $68 billion non-defense research budget of the entire U.S. government. Then you look at the other, there's 7 tech companies. The other 2 are Alibaba and Tencent.
Yeah.
And you combine the research budgets of China on AI alone, and it makes the less than $70 billion we spent on non-defense research seem pretty paltry.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you can't ignore it, and I think you're more of a financial investor. We're strategic, so I'm not lucky enough to be able to limit my investments to the Bay Area. So we're all over the world. So we've had 3 investments already in Israeli companies. We're in China now. We're in Japan, and one of the things I noticed, by the way, when I was last in Israel is talked to a lot of the startup companies, and I asked them, well, where are you getting your money from? I mean, there's a lot of Israeli VCs, and they go, we don't want that money anymore. I go, why not? They're too insulated. They don't offer us any value. There's money coming in here from all over the world now, and I think that's the technology industry is going global. We can't ignore it.
That's right.
I think we're going to have to go figure out how to incorporate all these technologies.
That's right.
Great. Well, we're going to turn now to the questions actually from you, the audience. So I will be reading them, I think. Is that right? Okay. I will be reading the questions and we'll throw them out. Some of them are addressed to specific panel members. Other of them are more general for the panel. First one I want to bring up actually raises a topic I wanted to get to and we ran out of time for, but it's sort of the issue of HR or talent. And so the question is, how should we market our careers in intelligence to the workforce of tomorrow? So, Dawn, maybe I'll ask you this, but how do you think about attracting the most talented technical folks into the agencies when they have the choices of working for you, working for Jeff at NVIDIA, or working for a startup company either founded by Scott or funded by Ann?
So I think the first thing we start with is that we don't expect we'll have employees for life anymore, and that's a big change for us as well. Right. And I think that's where we have to view this as a collaborative environment in terms of how we leverage each other through here. We're doing a lot more externships, for example, where we put people out into companies, and by the way, we're not putting them into the USG subsidiary, only does business with the government. We're putting them into the global technical analysis piece or whatever it is that makes sense, because we want to build well-rounded technologists. I will say that the thing that we believe and that we still see in our young people is that we have a mission that beats the heck out of doing quarterly earnings calls. And I don't mean that offensively to my business partners, but there's a lot of satisfaction when you know that you've been part of something that's either acknowledged or unacknowledged as making a difference in the security of the nation or in the security of a partner state. So I think that really, if we can get over the, if you leave us, you're now a traitor to us, that it's really just a growth opportunity. And of course, I think I represent that from a career perspective, right? The government's been very accepting of, me leaving and coming back in various roles. That gives a lot of hope to our folks to be able to see that, and that we want to maintain those relationships for life, just like technologists do, right? I still keep in touch with people that I was a young engineer with. Social media lets me do all of that, and I feel very comfortable reaching out to them still based on where they are in industry, and that's a network that we all need to leverage regardless of where we sit. So I think that's kind of the new way we go forward.
Let me just say something on the opposite side of that, which is now that we have some government customers and have a little bit more familiarity with what our customers are using our product for, it does speak to the mission point that Dawn said. The team is super engaged, more engaged in what the product is being used, the organizations that are stretching the limits of the product that the team has built, much more so than talking to some IT schmo at some industry. It's a really captivating opportunity from our side of the table as well to be able to be part of what the broader community is trying to accomplish. So that whole marketing, the HR side of it can play both ways. Our team is pretty engaged.
Yeah, I would just add that it used to be that the security segment of the software industry was its own segment, but now there is not a major software company that does not have cybersecurity employees as part of their overall software development process, including development of the software itself. So your career is open to the broader software industry, which of course is a grand, giant industry. Those 5 companies we mentioned earlier have a combined market cap of $3 trillion. Last year, of the $70 billion invested by venture capitalists, about $40 billion of that was invested in software companies, mostly young software companies, and all of them are hiring cybersecurity professionals. There's not enough of you, and I would encourage any of you, especially the women in the audience, to go back to your universities, spend time with the young undergraduates, encourage them to take STEM educations, especially women. We're only seeing 16% on average of the graduating classes of universities in STEM be women. That's very disappointing to Dawn and myself. Your career will flourish no matter what. You have the pick of the litter, to speak.
Great. So there's another question here that sort of fits as a follow-up, which is on the government side, both military and civilian, from a human capital perspective, there's a significant workforce of mission-experienced technical experts who may have no tradecraft or career framework and no avenue to contribute to or participate in the innovation center type collaboration efforts. How do industry partners incorporate or recruit these type of experts to help ensure that the real-world application of technology can integrate into the intelligence and national security missions? Do they consider these unique and non-traditionally educated experts as a critical contributor within this solution space? So if I could summarize that maybe, I think what the question is asking is there an opportunity for mission-experienced members of the government workforce to either get involved, but perhaps aren't deep technical experts, to get involved either in the innovation programs going on in the government agencies, or are they attractive to startup companies like yours, Scott, where you might need more domain expertise than you have in your technology group as a whole to figure out how to apply your technology to these.
I think you used the right word, which is domain expertise. Selling to an IT guy at a law firm or a financial services firm is completely different than engaging with a justice organization or a defense organization. Having that domain expertise, whether it's a hard skill, not tradecraft related, or a soft skill, maybe a supporting skill, training, competency, deployment services, things like that, it's invaluable. I think that as we've expanded our footprint here, we've had to draw on that community of expertise that would be non-traditional in the Valley. Non-software developers, maybe software developers that have turned into a SE role or a deployment role that have an understanding of how these organizations that we're selling to deploy the capabilities and use it in the field. We're not a cleared facility. We're not sure exactly how our product is being used in our various companies or our customers, but we have personnel who can go and talk the talk with the people who are doing the tradecraft, and I think it's incredibly important. We wouldn't have thought of that had we not been participating in this community.
And if I can just jump on, we haven't talked at all about our classical supply chain partners. They're a great source. They do development side saddle with us. They are just as committed. They are just as expert as we are. And what we've been talking to some of those more classical suppliers about is you're sitting on a ton of cash, and or you could team with venture capitalists that could help you capitalize. Don't look at us as the baby, like a baby bird that took something from the lab bench and gets it to production. Flat is the new up in DC, in case you missed it. So thinking about non-traditional partnering so that you can bring things to a commercial market that also is useful to the government is another conversation that we are absolutely willing to have, and we're trusting the partners to make sure that the due diligence is done so that it is actually viable commercially, because otherwise we don't want to necessarily expose it, right? But we're okay with changing the water level for the planet. That's a good thing.
Great. So I have two questions that are sort of related. I'm going to combine them into one question for the group here. First question was, to what, if any extent, do you perceive the U.S. government is competing with foreign venture capital firms to acquire and develop the next generation of intelligence technologies? The second question is, to what degree would U.S. government agencies source globally? There are many innovations happening outside the United States, but is the U.S. government taking full advantage of it? If not, what can we do to improve global sourcing? To combine them in some ways, I would observe that foreign governments, there are certain foreign governments that are more closely tied to the venture capital industry in those countries than the U.S. government is tied to the U.S. venture capital industry. I'm not sure we want to increase the ties between that, but innovation is global. We've hit that point already. There are foreign investors coming into the United States and investing in U.S. companies that cloud those companies from a foci perspective. From a strategic perspective, Dawn, how do you think about that competition, if you will, for sourcing technology?
Look, so everybody in this audience is competitive. I mean, at some level, right? And I have to agree with what Steve said. There are some VC communities that are more closely tied to their government than others. And we've got to just be, again, we've got to be cognizant of that. It doesn't change the fact that development is global, and we have to have the best capability that we can render to support national security objectives. So this is another work in progress, but we've been having these conversations with In-Q-Tel and their leadership about what makes sense. We've had, for example, for those of you in the audience that are classical military IC, we've had 5-eye partnerships that have been very, very close and very, very open for years and years and years. That should not be an impediment to making an international investment, right? We got over that a long time ago, but unfortunately, sometimes the policies haven't caught up with the practice, and so those are the sorts of things that I think we have to work through.
One thing I would note that's changed in venture capital is that of all the new deals done last quarter, about 60% of the deals had a corporation in the deal as well. And this seems to be here to stay. It's not just a temporal effect. And these are global corporations. One of our companies had a round led by Dassault Systems, another one by Singtel. So that has really become quite important for corporations to participate in building innovation. They're coming in earlier as well as staying along the way. Microsoft, for example, started their first venture capital fund just a year ago. So watch what's happening in commercial industry and what might be a good model for the government as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you are seeing a very active corporate VC market. So we've made, I think in the last 9 months, 10 new investments, which is kind of a record for us. And going back to how the government, partners with the VC community, I think that if the VCs are financially driven, and so if they start making money by doing business with the government, you'll see more. And going back to Israel as an example, the government is really one of the major customers of most of the startups there. And a lot of the folks who start these startups have come out of the military. They understand the government needs. I don't know how we do that in the U.S., but I think if you get that flywheel turning, Don, you're going to see some major things happen. And I think we're just at the beginning of it.
So one of the topics we haven't talked a lot about yet, that there's a couple questions that come out from a different angle on, is artificial intelligence, right? And we have one of the core companies involved in artificial intelligence represented here in NVIDIA. But it's also a topic that's important to the U.S. government as it thinks about competing both in an intelligence world and a defense or military world. And yet, from a competition perspective, you have the big web consumer companies in China that are investing a lot in AI. You have the big web consumer companies in the United States that are investing a lot in AI. So a couple different questions as it relates to AI. First, for Dawn, The question is, can you describe the importance of AI to the future of CIA, and do you worry about this AI gap with China, and Russia? And do you fear a gap with industry there? So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that, and then Jeff will come back to you and talk a little bit as well.
Okay, so we counted, actually. We have 137 AI pilots inside of the organization as we speak, and that's a number that we came up with last week. We had our first community of interest. We had 100 people show up on their lunch hours from all over the organization. So this is a really, really important topic for us for probably all the obvious reasons. One of the challenges for us, and I'll just say this, look, I will bet on the innovation and the systems engineering of the United States every time. So, one of the things we talk about with In-Q-Tel is, as long as we keep going faster than everybody behind us, I don't want to spend my time trying to figure out how to fend them off. I just want to go faster than they can keep up, right? It's kind of if there's a bear in the woods, you just got to be faster than the slowest person. So I don't spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. But one of the things that is a challenge for us from an AI perspective, and this is, I talked about this with some of the VCs a couple of weeks ago, is if you think about what we do when we produce the Presidential's Daily Brief, right? We have to have really, really good evidence for why we're reaching the conclusions that we do. And so one of the things that I think is a challenge for the current AI community that I'm confident will get addressed but still needs to be done is it can't just be you put things into the black box and something comes out. We can't go to leadership and make a recommendation based on something that nobody understands what happened in the middle, right? And so I'm confident this will get addressed because healthcare is going to have to deal with it. The legal community is going to have to deal with it. It's not just us. Again, the government's a good bellwether in terms of what needs to be done, and we are, but it has to be addressed by the community. So that's a big piece of it. And then there's, I have a punch list of other things that I'm looking for. If I want to increase my confidence, what goes into do I need in order to make a really good assessment on the back end? Because that tells me what kind of collection that I need in order to raise confidence to be able to go advise national leadership. So we actually have a really nice punch list of things that I'd like to see the AI community work on writ large, that we work with In-Q-Tel and others to communicate so that we're actually helping influence the industry in a way that I think benefits all of the commercial market and not just the USG.
So Jeff, NVIDIA being on the core of the rise of AI, if you will, you must see all the interesting AI companies come and want to talk to NVIDIA. Talk about a little bit about the breadth of application that you're seeing out there for it, and also the breadth of global interest in it as well.
Yeah, so pretty open-ended question, but we're tracking around 1,500 AI startups right now through what we call our Inception program. I'd say the bulk of those are still in the U.S. I believe we're really just scratching the surface. We're in the early days of AI. I mean, AI's been around for many years. I studied it in computer science, many years ago when I was at Brown. But what's allowed it to kind of start to flourish right now is finally you have enough computing horsepower that can train neural networks in a parallel fashion that you can do something in minutes or hours instead of days or years. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the internet has allowed us to access vast amounts of data which are needed to train these deep neural networks. So the initial applications, as I said earlier, were, I think the low-hanging fruit was kind of voice and images and face recognition. What we're starting to see is people move more into kind of the data analytics. So breadth of applications. We just invested in a company, actually an Israeli company, doing malware detection using AI, clearly image and sound recognition. A lot of companies, accelerating databases using AI, automotive, drones, any kind of autonomous vehicle, robotics. Healthcare is another area that's going to be completely changed through AI, the ability to spot, cancers. And what's interesting is, I think it was about 2014 when finally the AI-driven image recognition systems over at the ImageNet competition exceeded the accuracy of humans. I think that was the turning point. I think Microsoft were the people who first proved that. So we're now at the point where AI can do things, more accurately than a human being. So I think the sky's the limit. And obviously we're seeing huge amounts of money coming in from the venture capital community in AI. Maybe too much, actually. I mean, if anything, it's so I'm not worried at all that we're going to get behind in this. I mean, Google has basically bet the farm on AI. I mean, that's how they're going to go compete with Amazon. Is their cloud is going to be the AI cloud. So I think there's plenty of innovation and there's plenty of room to run.
So a couple questions left that are specific to each of the panels. So I'm going to ask one question for each of the 4 panelists, and I think we'll probably be right around our time slot. And I'll start with you. Can you describe what you are seeing in the next generation of software startups that will disrupt the government?
Well, certainly, we're early in the last 3 innovation phases. It was 10 years ago that Yahoo released Hadoop, which sort of let people start getting their arms around big data. Of course, we now have a world where, microservices, APIs, IoT are the big forces. And the number of companies that are participating there are quite significant. When we talk about this thing called digital transformation, you've really got to get your house in order before you can use any of this AI stuff. Because you can't have silos of data. You have to have a data strategy. You have to anticipate that you're going to have devices. Remember, the smartphone is only 10 years old, a few months ago. So it's been really, really challenging for companies that are not the leading innovators to address multiple innovation cycles simultaneously. And to the comment about AI before, yes, every company that comes to us says they're an AI company. One thing to remember about venture capital, for every 1,000 companies that get their first round of venture capital, only 250 of them ever reach their 3rd round of capital. And the typical company that goes public is 10 years old. So it's a good question to answer because you won't see most of our companies for about 4 years from the A round. They're just not ready to talk to any big customers the size of the federal government. So what we really are seeing is a convergence of a new platform for actually building a much more composable, agile enterprise. We invested in MuleSoft 10 years ago because we saw all of these things first happening in the belief that they could become a big company against building a platform for integration. Today, we're looking at some of the big areas. The database world, still owned primarily by Oracle in the relational space. That is that old enterprise model that Scott talked about earlier. So we've got some big surprises planned to disrupt some of the more established legacy markets, but nothing will stand undisrupted given the agility, composability, and the scale of what the enterprise has to address while ignoring the monolithic past. One last thing I'll say is that we look at open source as to what will sort of throw oil on the fire. And it was in late 2015 that Google released TensorFlow. That, to us, is very similar to Hadoop being released by Yahoo. It means that every one of the big companies has to then release their own open source component to try to get the innovators to be on their platform. That allows our companies to build on this. So it was 3 years ago that we started seeing the first companies integrate machine learning realistically in the newer SaaS applications. These companies seem much more magical than the companies that just could integrate big data. So I think we will see this cognitive era in about 3 to 4 years have much more impact, but it will be most impactful for those enterprises that have really rebuilt their enterprises all the way from software development to the integration of IoT, microservices, APIs to be much more composable, agile, to move and to take in and out these pieces as they arrive.
Great. Scott, we'll move to you next. A little bit of a softball question. At a tactical level, what could the IC do to ease the transition of commercial technology into operations?
Yeah. How much time do I have?
1 minute.
So, as a startup, our litmus test is pretty simple. Who's going to buy our product? when I look at the commercial markets, we have a sales cycle for selling to an IT organization that's somewhere between 6 to 12 weeks. That means a sales guy can get a lead into the pipeline at the front end of the quarter and have that either killed or closed by the end of the quarter. And maybe if they're good, they can cycle through those a couple of times. Don't ask me what the sales cycle is selling to government organizations. It's silly. Be a more predictable customer for us. Tell us where you stand with us. We're not trying to do anything unnatural. We have limited resources. We'll go somewhere else. We just need to know what the story is. So be a predictable customer for your technology partners. That would be my softball answer to a softball question.
Can I just add one tiny
Sure.
thing? I think, and to our moderator here, we've had the opportunity to have select number of our companies work with In-Q-Tel over the last years. And that has been extremely helpful to have someone help navigate the federal government. So I would say also working on the federal government side as close as possible with In-Q-Tel is a fantastic bridge to the venture-backed companies if they're fortunate to have In-Q-Tel as one of their investors as well.
Thank you, Ann. I appreciate it. And we've had we've had great respect and pleasure working with you on those companies as well. Jeff, what is NVIDIA doing to increase the reliability of GPUs now that they are being used in critical computing applications? I think implied is as opposed to games.
So that's a good question. But first, let me echo Ann's comment.
Yeah.
In-Q-Tel has been extremely helpful to NVIDIA. And
You guys gonna make me blush here.
It's amazing to me how the breadth that you guys have found in Silicon Valley and beyond. I mean, I'd say half the companies that we talk to or get involved in, you guys are involved. So I don't know how you guys are doing it, but
Right.
I think this is a great thing. So I hope the government will continue to fund you guys. How are we improving reliability? Obviously, we're in the automotive market where reliability is really important as well. So, we're adding, security features to our platforms all the way down to the chip level. A lot of the innovation is being done in software, but I think we won't take unnatural acts to do things for the federal government, but I think all these things that are important to the government are also important to all of our other customers because, as we know, cyber, attacks, leave no one left untouched. So I think it's stuff that we have to already do anyway, and obviously it's a big area, and we're investing very heavily in our vertical business development on the government side. I think we've been hiring quite a few people, and I think you're going to see a lot more activity from us there.
Great. Thank you. Dawn, last question for you actually comes back a little bit to the human resource issue. So clearly there's some people out there thinking about their careers, which I think is fantastic. How are the U.S. agencies encouraging their own employees to become commercial entrepreneurs? E.g., Israel's 8200 unit alumni are founders of dozens of successful product companies, more so than the NSA and CIA alumni, it seems. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. And I want to say this in all sincerity. We also really value and treasure the partnership with In-Q-Tel. It's been a great run. So hopefully another 10 years or so with that. With respect to encouraging our own folks from an entrepreneur perspective, I talked a little bit about making it okay to go and start a company. And I have to tell you that I was in Silicon Valley last week, and about half the people that pitched us were former military or former IC or something, right? So it's happening because we do have domain expertise. But more than that, I think we actually have real technical expertise and know how to apply it and can talk about it in a way that it makes sense to a user community, that it's not just widget kids. And I saw that last week, and I think everybody here has seen that as well. The agency started actually a patent program, for example, which we had never even considered because, we're all super secret squirrel and we don't use our real names and all of those sorts of things. And just really trying to put the struts in place, because I think this is what young technologists want, is they really want to learn their craft. And they want to learn it in a context that they can see the results of the application and the hard work. And that's what we can do in a huge way for our young people. And collectively we can do that, and we all benefit. If we can get to the point where we can allow them to flow through and see all pieces of the technology life cycle and everything that that means, then I think we will continue to be the most innovative country on the planet, and that only has wonderful implications for a national security mission.
So we've run out of time here. I apologize to those of you who asked questions I was unable to get to. I would commend the audience. Your questions were fantastic, probably better than mine. So next time I'll just get up here and read your questions, and we'll an even better panel. But thank you for your interest, enthusiasm, and sitting with us. Please enjoy your lunch and the exhibit hall. The next breakout sessions will begin at 12:45. And before you go, please join me in a round of applause thanking the panelists here.